My friends, I want you to hear me today. God is working in your life right now. You may not see it, you may not understand it, but the hand of God is shaping you, molding you, preparing you for something greater than you can imagine. The Bible says in Isaiah 64:8, "Yet you, Lord, are our Father. We are the clay, you are the potter. We are all the work of your hand." That means God isn't finished with you. You are a work in progress. And today I want to share with you 5 signs that God is shaping you right now. Signs you cannot ignore. Life is full of moments that test us, moments that shake our faith, and moments that make us question everything we know. Trials come in many forms: pain, loss, disappointment, betrayal, financial hardship, or even uncertainty about the future. These moments are never easy, and when they happen, our first instinct is often to ask, "Why, God? Why is this happening to me?" It's natural to feel discouraged when life takes unexpected turns. But what if those very trials were the tools God is using to shape you into the person He created you to be? When we look at Scripture, we see that trials are not a sign that God has abandoned us. In fact, they are often evidence that He is actively working in our lives. James 1:2-3 tells us, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance." This is a radical statement. Joy in trials? How is that possible? The answer lies in understanding that every hardship we face is an opportunity for growth, refinement, and transformation. God is like a skilled potter, shaping clay. A lump of clay on its own has no beauty, no form, no purpose. But in the hands of the potter, it is molded, pressed, stretched, and sometimes even broken down to be remade into something beautiful. The process is not gentle. It involves pressure, fire, and reshaping. But without it, the clay would remain a formless lump. In the same way, our trials are the pressure points God uses to mold us, shaping our character, deepening our faith, and making us more like Him. Throughout the Bible, we see that some of God's greatest servants went through tremendous trials before stepping into their purpose. Joseph was betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused and imprisoned. It would have been easy for him to lose hope, to believe that God had abandoned him. But in every season of his suffering, God was preparing him for something greater. Joseph's faith remained strong, and in time he rose to a position of power in Egypt, saving countless lives, including those of the very brothers who betrayed him. What seemed like a life of unfair suffering was actually a journey of preparation. Then there's Job, a man who lost everything: his wealth, his health, and even his family. His suffering was so great that even his closest friends doubted him, telling him he must have done something wrong to deserve such hardship. But Job remained faithful. He refused to turn away from God, and in the end, he was restored beyond what he had before. His story reminds us that trials are not a sign of God's punishment, but an opportunity to trust Him more deeply. Paul, one of the greatest evangelists in history, also endured incredible suffering. He was beaten, imprisoned, shipwrecked, and faced constant danger. Yet in 2 Corinthians 12:9-10, he says, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Paul understood that his suffering was not in vain. It was through his weakness that God's strength was made known. Trials strip away our reliance on ourselves. They remind us that we are not in control, but God is. When things are going well, it is easy to trust in our own abilities, our own plans, and our own understanding. But when life becomes difficult, we are forced to lean on God in a way we never have before. We pray more earnestly. We seek His guidance more desperately, and we draw closer to Him. Trials also teach us perseverance. Just as an athlete must train, pushing their body through pain and exhaustion to build strength, we too must endure challenges to grow spiritually. If life were always easy, we would never develop the endurance, faith, and character needed to fulfill God's purpose for us. Romans 5:3-4 says, "Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope." God allows trials because He sees what we cannot. He knows the strength that will come from the struggle, the faith that will be deepened, and the testimony that will come from endurance. Think about your own life. The moments that shaped you the most were probably not the easy ones. They were the moments when you faced obstacles, when you struggled, when you had to fight through the pain and trust that God was still in control. Perhaps you didn't see it then, but looking back, you can see how those difficulties strengthened you, changed you, and drew you closer to God. God never wastes a trial. Every hardship, every setback, and every painful moment is being used for a purpose. He is shaping you, refining you, and preparing you for something greater than you can imagine. Even when you don't understand, even when the road is difficult, trust that He is at work. Your trials are not meant to break you. They are meant to build you into the person God has called you to be. Life often unfolds in ways we do not expect. We make plans, set goals, and work toward a future that we envision for ourselves. But then something happens. Doors close, opportunities slip away, and everything we thought was certain suddenly feels unstable. In those moments, it is easy to become frustrated, confused, and even disheartened. We wonder why things are not going as planned and question whether we have done something wrong. But what if those closed doors were not a sign of failure, but rather God's way of redirecting us towards something far greater than we could ever imagine? God's plans are always higher than our own. Proverbs 16:9 says, "In their hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps." This verse reminds us that while we may have our own ideas about how life should go, it is ultimately God who determines the path we walk. We may see only a small piece of the picture, but God sees the entire masterpiece. What feels like a setback to us is often a setup for something better. When our plans do not work out, it may be because God is closing a door that is not meant for us, so that He can lead us to one that is. Throughout the Bible, we see examples of God redirecting people's paths for a greater purpose. One of the clearest examples is the life of Moses. He grew up in Pharaoh's palace, living a life of privilege and power. He may have thought that he would use his influence to help his people, the Israelites. But when he took matters into his own hands and killed an Egyptian, his plans fell apart. He was forced to flee into the wilderness, leaving behind everything he had known. For 40 years, he lived as a shepherd, far removed from the grand plans he may have once had for himself. Yet it was in that very wilderness that God prepared him for something greater. When the time was right, God called Moses back, not to serve in Pharaoh's palace, but to lead his people out of slavery and toward the promised land. What looked like a failure was actually a divine redirection toward a purpose Moses never could have imagined. Another powerful example is the story of Paul. Before he became one of the greatest evangelists in history, Paul, then known as Saul, was on a very different path. He was a Pharisee determined to destroy the early Christian church. He believed he was doing the right thing, but he was walking in the wrong direction. Then on the road to Damascus, God intervened. A blinding light stopped Paul in his tracks, and in that moment, his life was forever changed. The path he had been pursuing so passionately came to an abrupt halt, and God placed him on an entirely new journey, one that would spread the gospel to the ends of the earth. Had Paul continued on his own course, he would have remained an enemy of Christ. But God, in his mercy, closed one door and opened another, leading Paul into a calling that would impact generations. God often allows our plans to fail because he knows they are not the best for us. Sometimes we hold on to things that were never meant for us. Relationships, jobs, ambitions, or even dreams that, while good, are not part of God's ultimate plan for our lives. When these things do not work out, we may feel disappointed or even heartbroken. But just because something does not happen the way we expected does not mean that God has forgotten us. In fact, it is often in those moments of disappointment that he is working the most. Think about a child who wants something that is not good for them. A loving parent will say no, not because they want to deny their child happiness, but because they see what the child does not. In the same way, God sometimes says no or closes doors in our lives because he sees the dangers, the detours, or the distractions that we cannot. He is protecting us from settling for less than is best. Sometimes the reason our plans do not work out is that God has something even greater in store. But we must be willing to trust him. This requires faith. Faith that even when we do not understand, God is still in control. Isaiah 55:8-9 reminds us, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." What we see as an ending, God sees as a new beginning. What we view as a loss, God sees as an opportunity to bring us into something far better. When a door closes, instead of asking, "Why did this happen?" we should ask God, "What are you leading me toward?" If we approach life with the understanding that God is always working for our good, we will begin to see closed doors not as rejections, but as divine redirections. He is always leading us, always guiding us, and always shaping us for his perfect purpose. Even when our plans do not work out, we can trust that his plan never fails. There are moments in life when you feel something stirring deep within your soul. You may not be able to explain it, but you know something is changing. You feel restless, unsettled, or even drawn towards something new. This is not a coincidence. Many times that stirring is God speaking to your heart, calling you to trust him in a deeper way, guiding you toward his purpose for your life. God does not always speak in loud, dramatic ways. Often he speaks in a still, small voice, nudging us gently toward his will. This is what happened to Elijah in the Bible. After a great victory against the prophets of Baal, Elijah found himself running for his life, discouraged and afraid. He hid in a cave, waiting to hear from God. The Bible tells us in 1 Kings 19:11-12, that there was a powerful wind, but God was not in the wind. Then came an earthquake, but God was not in the earthquake. After that, there was a fire, but God was not in the fire. Finally, there was a gentle whisper, and that was where Elijah heard God. Sometimes we expect God to give us a dramatic sign, but often he simply places a stirring in our hearts, a quiet voice calling us to something new. That stirring can come in different ways. It may be a feeling that you are meant for something more, a holy restlessness that will not go away. It may be a growing desire to serve, to change direction, or to step out in faith. Sometimes it comes as a dissatisfaction with where you are, not because you are ungrateful, but because God is preparing you for the next season of your life. Other times it comes as a deep burden for something, a passion placed in your heart that aligns with God's purpose. Think of Nehemiah. He was a cupbearer to the king, living in comfort and security. Yet when he heard about the broken walls of Jerusalem, something stirred within him. He could have ignored it. He could have stayed where he was and continued living a comfortable life. But that burden was from God. It pushed him to pray, to seek God's direction, and to take action. That stirring led Nehemiah to leave his position and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, fulfilling a great purpose for God's people. When God places a stirring in your heart, he is calling you to trust him. It is an invitation to step into something greater, to walk by faith even when you do not have all the answers. But the truth is, many people ignore that stirring. Fear holds them back. They question whether it is really God speaking or just their own thoughts. They worry about what others will think or whether they are qualified. Moses felt this way when God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. He gave excuse after excuse, saying he was not a good speaker, that people would not listen to him, that he was not the right person for the job. But God reminded him that it was not about his ability, it was about God's power working through him. If you feel a stirring in your heart, do not ignore it. Pray about it. Seek God's guidance. Ask him to make his will clear. Often he will confirm it through his word, through circumstances, or through the wisdom of others. But at some point, you must take a step of faith. Abraham was called to leave his home and go to a land God would show him. He did not have all the details. He did not know exactly where he was going, but he trusted God, and because of his obedience, he became the father of many nations. God stirs our hearts because he has a purpose for us. He does not want us to stay stagnant or complacent. He calls us to grow, to move forward, to trust him more deeply. If you feel that holy stirring, do not push it aside. It may be the very thing that leads you into the greatest season of your life. God is working in you, speaking to you, and guiding you into his perfect will. Trust him, and he will lead you exactly where you need to be. There are seasons in life when everything feels uncertain. The things that once felt familiar no longer provide comfort, and the path ahead seems unclear. You may feel like you are in a place of discomfort, a season where you have lost something or where nothing seems to be working out the way you expected. In these moments, it is easy to feel discouraged, to wonder if you have made a mistake, or to question whether God is still with you. But what if this discomfort is not meant to harm you, but to transform you? What if God is using this season to shape you into the person he created you to be? Throughout the Bible, we see that God often moves his people out of their comfort zones to accomplish his purpose. He calls them to leave behind what is familiar so they can step into something greater. When God told Abraham to leave his homeland and go to a land he would show him, it required faith. Abraham had to leave behind everything he knew, his home, his people, his security. He did not have a detailed plan or a clear map, but he had God's promise. And because of his obedience, God made him the father of many nations. Moses also had to leave behind the familiar. He had spent 40 years in the wilderness as a shepherd, far removed from the life he once knew in Egypt. But then God called him to go back, to stand before Pharaoh and to lead the Israelites out of slavery. This was not an easy task. Moses was afraid. He doubted himself. He felt unqualified. But God was not asking Moses to rely on his own strength. He was calling him to trust in divine power. The discomfort Moses felt was part of the process of transformation. Discomfort is often a sign that God is stretching you, preparing you for something new. It may come in different forms. Sometimes it is the feeling of being stuck, as if the things that once satisfied you no longer do. You may find that the job you once loved no longer brings joy. or that the place where you have been for so long no longer feels like home. Other times, discomfort comes through loss, losing a job, a relationship, or a season of life you were not ready to let go of. When these things happen, it is tempting to cling to the past, to hold on to what feels safe. But sometimes, God removes certain things from our lives because they are no longer meant for us. Think about a caterpillar. For a time, it crawls on the ground, living as it always has, but when it is time for transformation, it enters a cocoon. That process is uncomfortable. It is dark, isolating, and difficult. If you did not know what was happening, you might think the caterpillar was trapped or even dying. But in reality, something incredible is taking place. It is being transformed into a butterfly. If it tried to go back to being a caterpillar, it would miss out on what it was meant to become. The same is true for us. God sometimes places us in uncomfortable seasons because He is preparing us for something new. The Israelites experienced this as well. After being delivered from slavery in Egypt, they found themselves in the wilderness. It was not what they expected. They thought they would reach the promised land quickly, but instead they wandered for 40 years. They complained, they doubted, they even wanted to go back to Egypt, the very place where they had been enslaved. But God was using the wilderness to shape them, to teach them dependence on Him, to prepare them for the land He had promised. Discomfort is not a sign that God has abandoned you. It is often a sign that He is at work in your life. It is in the moments of uncertainty that we learn to trust Him more deeply. When things are comfortable, it is easy to rely on our own strength. But when we are stretched, when we do not have all the answers, that is when we truly learn what it means to have faith. If you are in a season of discomfort right now, do not be discouraged. God is not punishing you. He is preparing you. He is molding you, refining you, and calling you to something greater. The discomfort will not last forever, but the transformation it brings will shape you for the rest of your life. Trust Him in the process, because on the other side of this season is something far greater than you could ever imagine. There are moments in life when you feel completely unqualified for what lies ahead. You may feel like you do not have the skills, the strength, or the wisdom to step into the place where God is leading you. Doubt creeps in, whispering that you are not good enough, not smart enough, not strong enough. Fear tells you that you will fail, that you will be judged, that you are simply not the right person for the job. But here is the truth. God does not call the qualified. He qualifies the called. He is not looking for people who have everything figured out. He is looking for those who are willing to trust Him even when they feel unprepared. Throughout the Bible, God consistently chooses people who seem unlikely, people who feel inadequate, people who the world might overlook. When God called Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, Moses immediately listed all the reasons he was not the right choice. He told God that he was not a good speaker, that people would not listen to him, that he was not capable of such a great task. But God was not concerned with Moses' weaknesses. He simply said, "I will be with you," Exodus 3:12. That was all that mattered. Moses' success was never about his own ability. It was about God's power working through him. Gideon had a similar experience. When God called him to lead Israel against their enemies, he was hiding in fear. He saw himself as weak and insignificant. But God called him a mighty warrior and assured him that He would be with him. With God's help, Gideon led a small army to victory against overwhelming odds. What seemed impossible became possible because God was the one who made it happen. David was just a shepherd boy when he was chosen to be king. He was the youngest in his family, overlooked by others, yet God saw his heart. When he faced Goliath, he was not the strongest warrior. He was just a boy with a sling and 5 stones. But he had something greater than weapons or experience. He had faith. He knew that the battle was not his alone, but God's. And because of that, he stepped forward in confidence and defeated the giant. The disciples were also unlikely choices. They were fishermen, tax collectors, and ordinary men with no special qualifications. Yet Jesus called them to follow him, to spread the gospel, to be the foundation of the church. They had no formal religious training, no great influence, no personal achievements that made them stand out, but they had one thing: they were willing. And because of that, God used them to change the world. Paul, one of the greatest evangelists in history, started as someone who persecuted Christians. He was the last person anyone would have expected to become a leader in the faith. But when God called him, he was transformed. His past did not disqualify him. His mistakes did not define him. God chose him not because of his perfection, but because of his purpose. The same is true for you. You may feel unqualified, unprepared, or incapable. But if God is calling you to something, it is not about your ability. It is about his power working through you. He does not ask you to have all the answers. He does not expect you to be perfect. He simply asks you to trust him, to take a step of faith, to be willing. God equips those he calls. He gives strength to the weak, wisdom to the uncertain, and courage to the fearful. If he has placed something on your heart, if he is calling you to step into something new, do not let fear hold you back. Do not listen to the voice that says you are not enough. Instead, listen to the voice of truth, the voice that says, I will be with you. When you feel unqualified, remember that you are in good company. Every great man and woman of faith felt the same way at some point, but they did not let their doubts stop them. They trusted God, and because of that, they stepped into their calling. You do not have to be the strongest, the smartest, or the most experienced. You just have to be willing to say yes. And when you do, you will see that God's power is more than enough. He will use you in ways you never imagined, not because of who you are, but because of who he is. Sometimes the greatest evidence that God is shaping you is the change happening inside of you. It is not always something you can see outwardly at first, but deep within, you begin to notice shifts in your thoughts, desires, and the way you respond to life. The things that once satisfied you no longer do. The distractions that once held your attention begin to lose their grip. You start longing for something more, not just more success, more money, or more recognition, but more of God. That longing is a sign that he is working in you, drawing you closer, preparing you for something greater. God often starts his work in our hearts before he changes anything else in our lives. He refines us, molds us, and prepares us for what is ahead. Think of Joseph in the Bible. He had dreams of greatness, but before those dreams were fulfilled, he had to go through a process of transformation. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. For years it seemed as though his life was going in the opposite direction of his calling. But during that time, God was shaping his character. He was teaching him humility, patience, and trust. By the time Joseph stepped into his purpose as a leader in Egypt, he was not the same young man who had once been full of pride. He was a man shaped by trials, ready to handle the responsibility God had placed on him. The process of transformation is often uncomfortable. When God begins to change you, you may feel a sense of restlessness. You may begin to outgrow certain habits, relationships, or mindset. You may find yourself craving more time in his presence, hungering for his word, or feeling convicted about things you once ignored. This is not a sign that something is wrong. It is evidence that God is moving in your life. He is making you more like him. Consider Peter. Before he became the bold preacher at Pentecost, he was a man full of impulsiveness and fear. He had moments of great faith, like when he stepped out of the boat to walk on water, but he also had moments of doubt, like when he began to sink. He boldly declared that he would never deny Jesus, yet when the moment of testing came, he denied him 3 times. But God was not finished with Peter. Through his failures and struggles, Peter was being shaped. After Jesus' resurrection, Peter was restored, and on the day of Pentecost, he preached with such power that thousands came to faith. The same man who once denied Christ out of fear was now boldly proclaiming his name. God's transformation is not just about external changes, it is about the deep work he does within. He takes a heart that was once filled with fear and fills it with faith. He takes a mind that was once consumed by doubt and fills it with truth. He takes a person who once felt unworthy and reminds them of their identity in him. This kind of transformation does not happen overnight. It is a process, a journey of becoming more like Christ. Paul describes this transformation in Romans 12:02. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. This renewal happens as we surrender to God daily, as we allow his word to shape our thoughts, as we trust him in the process. Little by little, he changes the way we see ourselves, the way we see others, and the way we see him. Sometimes the change is so gradual that we do not even realize it is happening. It is like a seed planted in the ground. At first, it seems like nothing is happening. But beneath the surface, roots are growing, and one day that seed breaks through the soil and begins to flourish. In the same way, God is working in you, even when you cannot see it. If you have noticed a shift in your heart, if you feel a deeper hunger for God, if you are being drawn to prayer, if your perspective is changing, know that this is not by accident. God is shaping you for something greater. He is preparing you for what is ahead. Keep pressing in. Keep trusting him. The work he has started in you, he will bring to completion. You may not see the full picture yet, but one day you will look back and realize that every change, every shift, every moment of growth was leading you exactly where he wanted you to be.